This global peace structure matches a prophetic pattern too closely. On January 22, 2026, something was formalized that most people barely noticed. Are you ready to see the pattern? Because on that date, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, something was formalized that matches the patterns we've been examining. Here's what happened. The Board of Peace was formally ratified, not proposed, not discussed, ratified, made operational, given legal personality, established with defined structure, mechanisms, and authority. President Trump signed the charter in a public ceremony. 26 nations participated in the ratification as founding members. The United Nations Security Council endorsed Trump's comprehensive plan, which includes the board, through Resolution 2803 in 2025, welcoming its establishment. And what was created wasn't just diplomatic rhetoric, it was an actual organization with legal status, with an operational mandate, with a defined purpose and authority. Now let me be absolutely clear about what the Board of Peace actually is, because accuracy matters when we're examining prophetic significance. This is a US-led framework focused initially on Gaza. Its stated mandate includes ceasefire oversight, reconstruction coordination, security management, and governance support in the post-conflict period. It's transitional, meaning it's designed for the specific situation following the Gaza conflict. It operates with UN Security Council endorsement, giving it international legitimacy. 26 nations participated in the initial ratification as founding members, including the UAE, Hungary, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt, among others. But here's what makes this structurally significant, and you'll see exactly why when we examine the authority concentrated at its leadership. This isn't just a discussion forum. This isn't merely a diplomatic coordination mechanism. This is an organization with legal personality, with defined structure, with operational authority to actually implement decisions, with mechanisms for reconstruction oversight, security coordination, and governance support. And while it's currently focused on Gaza, while it's transitional in stated purpose, the framework's existence creates something that didn't exist before. A multinational peace structure with operational authority in one of the most prophetically significant regions on Earth. Think about what this represents practically. Before January 22, 2026, peace efforts in Gaza were either bilateral negotiations, UN-facilitated discussions, or informal regional coordination. There was no standing organization with legal personality and operational mandates specifically designed to oversee post-conflict reconstruction and governance. But now there is. Now there's a structure. Now there's an organization. Now there's a framework that multiple nations participate in, that the UN endorses, that has defined mechanisms for actually implementing peace-related decisions. That's a shift. That's a change. That's something new being created. And here's why the location of the ratification matters. Davos, the World Economic Forum, where approximately 3,000 participants from over 130 nations gather annually to discuss global challenges and coordinate approaches. The Board of Peace wasn't ratified in isolation. It was ratified at a gathering of global leaders, with international visibility, with the symbolic weight of being endorsed at one of the world's premier forums for international cooperation. And that location, that setting, that context, it all signals that this framework is intended to have international legitimacy, multinational participation, and coordinated implementation involving global leaders. Now, some might say, but this is just focused on Gaza. How can something so limited have prophetic significance? And that's a fair question. But here's what we need to understand, and this is going to become devastatingly clear when we examine the expansion language in the Charter. Structures rarely stay limited to their initial mandate. Organizations rarely remain as narrow as their founding purpose. Frameworks that prove effective in one situation become templates for others. And when you create a multinational peace structure with UN backing in the Middle East, you've created infrastructure that could be expanded, strengthened, or confirmed for broader application. You've built a mechanism, you've established a model, you've normalized a pattern, and all of that could potentially be used later for purposes beyond the initial Gaza focus. But here's what we must emphasize. We're not claiming the Board of Peace is definitively the covenant of Daniel 9:27. We're not predicting that the tribulation begins now. What we are saying is that a multinational peace structure was formally created, and all of that matches patterns that Daniel's prophecy tells us to watch for. Now we need to examine why this peace structure's initial focus on Gaza is so geographically and prophetically significant. Because some might think Gaza is just one small region. How can focusing there have broader implications? But when you understand Gaza's position, when you recognize its role in the larger Israeli-Palestinian conflict, when you see how it connects to broader Middle East dynamics, you'll understand why starting with Gaza creates a pathway to comprehensive peace frameworks in the exact region Daniel's prophecy addresses. Here's what makes Gaza strategically critical. It's one of the oldest, most intractable, most symbolically charged flashpoints in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Every peace effort, every attempt at resolution, every framework for stability eventually has to address Gaza. You can't claim to have solved the Israeli-Palestinian conflict if Gaza remains hostile. You can't declare lasting peace in the region if Gaza continues launching attacks. You can't establish comprehensive security if Gaza remains a source of instability. So any serious peace framework ultimately must include Gaza, must provide solutions for Gaza, must create mechanisms that make Gaza stable and non-hostile. And that's why focusing on Gaza first makes strategic sense. If you can solve Gaza, if you can create stability there, if you can demonstrate that your framework actually works in one of the most difficult situations, you've proven the model. You've shown it can handle complexity. You've demonstrated it can deliver results where other approaches failed. And that success becomes the argument for expanding the framework, for applying it more broadly, for using it as the template for comprehensive regional peace. But here's the biblical pattern that makes this geographically prophetic, and this is absolutely critical. Peace in Scripture, especially end times peace, consistently focuses on Israel and surrounding regions. Daniel 9:27's covenant involves Israel. Ezekiel 38's invasion happens when Israel dwells safely. The Antichrist's covenant confirmation relates to Israel. The abomination of desolation occurs in the temple in Jerusalem. Revelation's bold judgments affect the Middle East. Christ returns to the Mount of Olives. Over and over, biblical prophecy places Israel at the geographic center of end times events. Not because Israel is more important than other nations theologically, but because God's prophetic plan focuses on this specific region for the final events before Christ's return. So when a multinational peace structure is created with Gaza as its entry point, when that structure involves Israel directly, when the stated goal is stability in this exact region, when the framework touches the geographic area where prophecy says the covenant will be confirmed, that's not random. That's not coincidental. And here's why Israel's involvement with this structure matters prophetically. For the covenant of Daniel 9:27 to function as prophecy describes, Israel must participate, must accept, must benefit from the peace being offered. Because the covenant creates security for Israel, enables Israel to feel safe, allows Israel to dwell in unwalled villages, as Ezekiel 38:11 describes. And if the Board of Peace is supportive to Israel, if Israel benefits from the stability it provides, if this framework creates conditions where Israel feels more secure, then you have exactly the dynamic Daniel's prophecy requires. Not the final fulfillment necessarily, but the pattern, the conditions, the type of relationship between Israel and a multinational peace framework that could later be confirmed by the Antichrist. Now we need to examine the internal structure of the Board of Peace, because this is where the framework's true nature becomes clear. And when you understand how authority is distributed, when you see the powers concentrated at leadership level, when you recognize what this enables, you'll understand why this isn't just diplomatic cooperation, but structural consolidation. And that consolidation, that concentration of authority, that matches another element of the prophetic pattern. Here's what the structure actually includes. The Board of Peace has a chairman, and that chairman isn't just a figurehead. The chairman has veto power over major decisions, has authority over membership questions, has oversight of resource allocation, has control over the framework's direction and priorities. This isn't collective decision-making where all participants have equal voice. This is centralized authority, where one figure holds decisive power over the organization's operations. Now, let me be clear about current reality versus potential prophetic significance. The chairman position is designated for life in the charter, unless the chairman voluntarily resigns or the executive board unanimously determines incapacity. While the initial framework is transitional and focused on Gaza, it is not a permanent global peace body without limits. But what we can say accurately is that significant authority is concentrated at the chairman level, that decisions require chairman approval, that the structure creates top-level control, rather than purely distributed governance. And that concentration, while currently limited in scope and duration, establishes a pattern, a model, a type of authority structure that could later be strengthened, expanded, or confirmed for broader application. Think about what concentrated authority enables. First, rapid decision-making. When one figure has veto power, when one leader controls membership, when one chairman oversees resources, decisions happen quickly. There's no endless committee deliberation, no consensus building across dozens of equal parties, no paralysis through disagreement. The chairman decides, the organization implements, and that efficiency, that ability to act decisively, that's appealing to nations desperate for solutions. That's attractive to populations exhausted from paralysis. That's effective when crisis demands rapid response. Third, and this is where it becomes prophetically significant, concentrated authority creates the infrastructure through which one figure could exercise comprehensive control. The Board of Peace currently isn't the beast's authority. The chairman currently isn't the Antichrist. But the structure, the pattern, the concentration of decision-making power at the top level, that's exactly the type of framework through which eventual comprehensive authority could operate. Because if you already have a multinational peace organization with concentrated top-level authority, and if that framework expands from Gaza to broader regional application, and if a future leader confirms or strengthens that framework, you don't need to build new infrastructure. You just need to take control of what already exists. And here's the comparison that should make everyone pause. This isn't diplomacy by consensus. This isn't peace through equal partnership. This is structure-based authority. Peace delivered through organized framework with concentrated decision-making power. And while that might be efficient, While that might solve problems that consensus couldn't handle, while that might deliver stability faster than distributed governance, it's also the type of structure that can transition from solving problems to controlling populations, from providing peace to enforcing compliance, from offering security to demanding submission. Not because those transitions are inevitable, but because concentrated authority creates the capability for exactly those transitions if the wrong person gains control. Now, we need to examine who's actually designing and implementing this framework, because understanding the architects tells us something about the nature and potential scope of what's being built. And when you see the types of expertise involved, when you recognize the backgrounds represented, when you understand the skills these architects bring, you'll realize this isn't just about stopping violence. This is about managing systems, about reconstructing economies, about establishing governance. And that comprehensive approach, that systematic methodology, that's precisely what makes this framework different from previous peace efforts. Let me show you who's involved. Not military generals planning campaigns, not theologians debating religious questions, not politicians purely focused on public opinion. Instead, diplomatic figures with extensive negotiation experience, financial power brokers who understand reconstruction funding, development experts who know how to rebuild infrastructure, technocrats skilled in governance systems, economic frameworks, and institutional design. And here's why the expertise profile matters. Previous peace efforts in the Middle East often focused primarily on stopping violence, getting combatants to cease hostilities, negotiating terms that both sides could accept. But the Board of Peace's architects bring different expertise. They're not just stopping violence. They're planning what comes after. They're designing reconstruction. They're establishing governance. They're creating economic systems. They're building comprehensive frameworks for post-conflict stability. And that shift, that expansion from stopping war to managing peace, that's what makes this structurally different. You need economic understanding to create trade, employment, stability that gives populations reasons to maintain peace. You need diplomatic capability to coordinate among multiple nations. You need legal expertise to create binding frameworks. You need technical knowledge to implement complex systems. This isn't simple negotiation. This is systematic reconstruction of an entire region's stability. And the technocratic approach, the focus on systems and frameworks rather than just negotiations, that's precisely what enables the kind of comprehensive control that prophecy describes the beast eventually exercising. Because technocrats don't rule through charisma, they rule through systems. They don't control through force alone. They control through frameworks that make compliance seem necessary. They don't demand submission, obviously. They create structures where participation becomes required for accessing basic services, economic opportunity, security provision. And all of that happens gradually, systematically, through expertise rather than through drama. Now, here's what we need to understand about why this matters prophetically. The Antichrist won't just be a military leader. He'll be a problem solver, someone who delivers solutions that others couldn't provide, someone who brings order to chaos, someone who makes systems work when they were failing. And the expertise required for that, the capabilities needed to manage comprehensive reconstruction and governance, that's exactly what we're seeing assembled in the Board of Peace's architect profile. Not proof that these specific individuals are related to the Antichrist, but demonstration that the skill sets, the expertise, the systematic approach to peace management, these are being normalized. These are being proven effective. These are being established as the model for how peace is achieved. And here's the psychological impact of technocratic peace. When peace comes through expert management rather than through inspiring leadership, when stability is delivered through systems rather than through charismatic vision, populations don't follow a person. They depend on a framework, system. And whoever controls the system controls them. This is why the architects matter, why their expertise profile is significant, why the technocratic approach is worth noting, because it demonstrates that peace is being approached systematically. Now, we need to understand why that phrase, "with many," is so absolutely critical for properly interpreting this prophecy. Because this detail eliminates a lot of speculation. It narrows what we should be watching for. It gives us specific criteria. And when you understand what "with many" actually means, when you recognize the implications, when you see how this shapes what the covenant must look like, you'll have a biblical framework for evaluating whether modern peace structures match the pattern. Think about what "with many" tells us. This isn't a bilateral agreement. It's not just Israel and one neighboring nation signing a peace treaty. It's not two powers coming together. It's multinational, multiple parties, broad participation. And that multinational character serves several purposes that make the covenant more effective, more comprehensive, more difficult to violate, and more binding than a simple bilateral treaty could ever be. First, multinational agreements carry more legitimacy. When two nations sign a treaty, either one can violate it, and the consequences are relatively limited. But when many nations endorse an agreement, when multiple powers are invested in its success, when numerous parties have signed on, violation becomes more costly. Because you're not just breaking an agreement with one nation. You're violating a framework that many nations support. You're defying international consensus. You're risking isolation from multiple powers simultaneously. That creates pressure to maintain the agreement that bilateral treaties simply don't have. Second, multinational frameworks distribute responsibility. No single nation bears the entire burden of enforcement. No one power has to maintain the peace alone. Instead, many nations contribute. Many parties participate. Many powers have stake in the framework's success. And that distribution of responsibility makes the system more sustainable, more resilient, less dependent on any single nation's continued commitment. Because if one party weakens, others remain. If one nation's political situation changes, the framework continues. The multinational character creates redundancy that makes the covenant harder to abandon. Third, and this is where it gets prophetically significant, multinational agreements create the foundation for centralized authority. Think about it. When you have many nations coordinating around a shared framework, you need coordination mechanisms. You need decision-making structures. You need authority that can adjudicate disputes, enforce compliance, coordinate action, and gradually, as the multinational framework develops, as the coordination becomes more comprehensive, as the mechanisms become more established, authority that was originally distributed starts concentrating. And that concentration, that centralization, that's the pathway through which one figure could eventually exercise the kind of comprehensive control that Revelation describes the beast having. Now apply this to what we should watch for in modern developments. We're not looking for bilateral peace treaties. We've had many of those. Israel has signed agreements with Egypt, with Jordan, with various nations through the Abraham Accords. Those are significant. Those matter. But they're not what Daniel describes. What Daniel describes is a covenant with many, multinational, broad participation, coalition-based. And that's different. That's a structural framework rather than a bilateral agreement. That's coordinated international action rather than two-party negotiation. And here's why this matters for understanding the Board of Peace. The Board of Peace, as formalized in January 2026, is multinational. It's not just the United States and one partner. It's 26 nations as founding members, with more expressing interest in joining. It's UN-backed, giving it international legitimacy. It's coalition-based, with multiple parties contributing. And it's structured, with defined mechanisms for coordination, decision-making, and action. That's not bilateral. That's with many. That's the pattern Daniel describes. Not definitively the fulfillment, but remarkably similar to what we're told to watch for. And here's the historical precedent that reinforces why with many matters. Throughout history, the most effective control systems have been multinational. Empires that conquered diverse regions couldn't rule through force alone. They needed cooperation. They needed local authorities willing to participate in the imperial system. They needed distributed responsibility for maintaining order. And the most successful empires were those that convinced many parties that participation served their interests. That created frameworks where many nations chose to be part of the system because the benefits outweighed the cost of independence. That's how comprehensive authority actually works. Not through one power conquering everyone else, but through many powers choosing to participate in a coordinated system. And that's what, with many, tells us to watch for. Peace frameworks that aren't just bilateral, but multinational. Agreements that involve broad participation. Structures where many nations cooperate because they believe it serves their interests. And when you see those patterns emerging, when you observe frameworks with those characteristics being formalized, when you recognize that what's being built matches what Daniel described, you're not speculating wildly. You're comparing observable developments to biblical prophecy. You're recognizing patterns. You're discerning whether the stage is being set. And that's exactly what Scripture calls us to do.